Today's lesson is called What is Science? We're going to talk about what science is and what science isn't. Scientists have an ongoing goal to try to explain the things that we observe in our world. And scientists discover new information about our world all the time, but of course, they can't answer every single question. So I'm going to challenge you today to think about questions that can be answered in science and questions that can't be answered in science. And we'll discuss a few examples of each type of these questions. Science can be applied to really any question where the answer can be observed, researched, or investigated, or measured in some way. In other words, where evidence can be found. But science can't answer questions if evidence is not available. For example, what is the purpose of life? There's no way to answer that with evidence or data, so science can't really truly answer that question. So our learning goals are to describe the goals of science, to explain the procedures at the core of the scientific methodology, also known as scientific method, and we also should be able to define what a scientific theory is. So why should we study science? Well, you might want to pause the video right here and think about that for a little bit. Think about what kind of answer you come up with and see if it aligns with what I share with you here in the next few minutes. Now, a possible response to that maybe you came up with would be something like, we should study science to learn more about the world around us. And that would be legitimate. So how would you describe biology? What do you already know about it? You might think that biology is the study of all life, and that would be very technically accurate because pretty much that's what the word biology means. Or maybe you described in your head some previous science courses that you've taken that have involved biology, such as life science or something along that line. And that too would be correct. Well, science is where we use evidence in order to construct testable explanations and predictions of natural phenomena. We also use this to develop knowledge through this process. So, how do you really know about something? Well, one way to know about something is to learn about it, or to observe something for yourself. So where does all this knowledge come from? Well, a lot of the knowledge that we can learn is learned from other people who have studied those particular topics. So what does it mean if we were to say that science is a process? How is science a process? Well, the word process indicates that science is something that people do rather than just a group of facts. So science is a process because there are steps that we take in order to gain knowledge through observation. So, do you think the phrase, a way of knowing, would be a phrase that could accurately describe science as a method of learning? Why or why not? Think about that for a moment. Because the answer simply is yes. The phrase identifies science as a method or a tool that can be used to learn about the natural world. Now, one goal of science is to provide natural and testable explanations for events that can be observed in the natural world. But science also aims to use explanations supported by data to understand things like patterns that we find in nature and to make useful predictions about natural events like the weather. Of course, we're still working on that one. We've gotten pretty good at predicting the weather, but we've got a ways to go. There's still some more accuracy that can be honed in there. So science rarely proves anything, and this is kind of the interesting thing. We've heard, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase a lot, trust the science. and other phrases like the science is settled. But if you really look at what science is, science rarely proves anything, because as we continue to gather more evidence, our understanding of the world continues to change and to improve. So the science is never truly settled because there's always more to learn about any particular topic. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say, trust the science because the science is settled. Highly, highly untrue. The science is never truly settled. We're always learning more. So that's something to keep in mind, especially today, these days, with debates on whether or not to trust vaccines that haven't been approved by the FDA yet, or to even trust vaccines that have been approved by the FDA when it comes to COVID and such things. So there's lots of things that people like to say, trust the science is settled. And now you know that science is never truly settled, otherwise it's not truly science. So I'm sure you've probably learned about the scientific method. It's something that we teach pretty much from early elementary school. And it's basically a set of 5 or 6 simple steps that are performed by all scientists, and they're always performed in the same order. Well, scientists, they do use these steps, but they're not always in the same order, or they don't use them in the same way as other scientists. The scientific methodology really just describes a general style of investigation that applies across all of the different branches of science. But what is meant by a general style? Well, scientists carry out investigations in a similar way, but not necessarily an identical way. Scientific investigations typically are going to begin with observation, which is simply the act of noticing or describing events or processes in a careful, orderly way. For example, if I were to ask you, describe the difference between the grasses at these 2 locations, you see on the screen here, location A and location B. What do you see? What differences do you see in these grasses? You probably are noticing that one grass in location A is much shorter than the grass in location B. Pretty much the only thing that's different, at least as far as I can observe. So that would be correct. And so an observation like this might lead to a question. So these are both marsh grasses, and observing that location A has short grass and location B has long grass might lead you to ask a question such as, why do marsh grasses, why do marsh grasses grow to different heights in different places? And that would be something that you could then study. So that is a simple scientific question, and that's kind of where the scientific methodology begins. First with an observation, grasses in location A are shorter than location B, and then a question. Why? Usually the question is a why question. Why is location A growing shorter grass than location B? All scientific investigations involve asking these kinds of questions. And in order to answer those questions, scientists try to focus on one specific factor that could be the difference maker. So why do we only study one factor at a time when asking a question? Well, that's a great question in and of itself. When we study more than one factor, it makes it impossible to tell if the observed changes are from one factor or the other. So you really can't answer the question as to what makes the difference. You need to figure out if it's just one single factor, or sometimes it can be multiple factors. But you won't know if you don't eliminate everything else. So, in other words, without some careful study of one factor at a time, you're not going to have an accurate explanation. You're not going to be able to reach that conclusion. So if a scientist were to study how both the amount of light and the amount of water affected the plant growth at the same time, What would the observations and data show? Well, it would be pretty much impossible to tell if the changes in the plants were due to light or to water differences. So, if you were to hypothesize what might be causing these differences, what would you come up with? You might come up with something like temperature or sunlight or maybe the amount of water, or perhaps it's the nutrients available in the soil. Well, the factor that was studied in this experiment is nitrogen, as you can see here on the screen. And so the scientists focus specifically on that. All right, so now you see that we've got a couple of definitions here, some vocab words. We've got inference and hypothesis. And a inference is a logical interpretation based on, maybe you know the answer to this, you can fill it out in your head, but an inference is a logical interpretation based on what scientists already know. But a hypothesis is a little bit different. A hypothesis is a tentative, meaning a temporary scientific explanation that can be further tested. Okay. So inference is a logical interpretation, basically drawing a conclusion based on what you already know. But a hypothesis is an explanation that we're going to be able to test further. Can you identify here in this image any differences between these two plots of marsh grasses? Probably not, because there are no observable differences. So what are some conditions in these plots that can be changed or that can change? Well, hopefully you're thinking of things like maybe the type of soil that it's in, or the amount of light that they receive, or maybe even the amount of water that each plot of grass receives. Well, testing hypotheses often involves, as it says, designing experiments that measure factors that can change that we call variables. This is one of your vocabulary words, so definitely want to be familiar with the term variables. Again, variables are factors that can change and are used to make measurements during experiments. So in this particular experiment, we have control groups and experimental groups. Now, in an experiment, you always have at least these two groups, and both of them have all of the same factors, or variables as we call them, except for one. And a scientist will change one variable between the two groups. So what variable is being changed in the example here? Well, it's the nitrogen that's being added. So in the control group, no nitrogen is added. So that's just what occurs naturally. And then in the experimental group, the marsh grasses that we're going to run this experiment on, the scientist adds nitrogen. So this variable that was changed by the scientists is called the independent variable. And the group that contains the independent variable is the experimental group. And the group that doesn't get that variable change is the control group. Now, that doesn't mean there's not nitrogen in the control group in that soil. It may be already there on its own, but we're not adding additional nitrogen as we are with the experimental group. So nothing changes in the control group, and that one single variable that we're focusing on it does get changed in the experimental group. All right, so if we take a look at what happens afterwards, after we've changed our variable, our independent variable, in the experimental group, we then observe what happens. And this is when we begin to do the next step in the scientific method, and that is collecting data. So there are two kinds of data that can be measured in number form, and there's data based on observations. So data that have numbers represent distinct quantities. So therefore, we call them quantitative data. Whereas the data that describes things with words and descriptions are called qualitative data. So they kind of describe the quality of the observation. So if we were to fill in the blanks up here on the board, we would say that blank data are numbers. That would be quantitative because numbers are a quantity, and the other one is that qualitative data are descriptive. They describe the observation being made. So in our experiment here, what type of data is being collected? Well, you can see that they are measuring the height of the grass. Therefore, they are collecting quantitative data because measurements are a number. Anything you can measure, whether it's measuring the length, the height, the width, the weight or mass, anything that you can measure and put a quantity to, a number to it, if there's a number involved, that is a quantitative piece of data. If it's something that you can describe, like the sky is blue, that is qualitative. Sometimes the sky is gray. Again, qualitative. It's not a number. It's not a quantity. It's a descriptive expression of the observation being made. In this case, you could say that the grass color. So if the experimental group turned brown, we would be able to collect quantitative data in terms of the height, and we would also be able to collect qualitative data in terms of the color, which we would explain in a descriptive manner. The experimental group turned brown and grew taller, whereas the control group stayed the same. All right, so oftentimes once we have collected data, in order to make some sense of the data or find patterns in the data, we will put this data into a spreadsheet or some kind of an application, software application that will generate graphics for us that make it much easier to interpret that data, especially when we're talking about quantitative data, where there's numbers involved. Height and time are examples of measurable numbers. We can measure how much time it takes for a change to occur. We can measure the height of that change. So those are all quantitative numbers that we can collect. And then we can put them into a graphic like you see here in order to make some sense out of that data. A lot of times we'll use that data to develop enough data to basically utilize the process called statistics, where we extrapolate or pull out solutions and conclusions based on the patterns that we find in the data. So statistics is using data to find patterns. And in the terms of the scientific method, this is called analyzing data. And based on our analysis, scientists can then come up with a conclusion for that particular experiment. So what do you think the conclusion of this experiment would be? Well, it seems as though, based on this data, that our experimental group that had the nitrogen added grew taller. So the conclusion would be that nitrogen caused the grass to grow higher. Now, once a conclusion's been made based on the data analysis, a scientist is often going to go back to the original hypothesis and either revise it or do some other similar experiment. So they're going to revise it, particularly if they didn't see the results they wanted to see. Perhaps the nitrogen added experimental group still stayed the same height as the control group. So the scientists would go back and say, okay, maybe it's not nitrogen. So he would come up with a new hypothesis that perhaps it's the exposure of sunlight. And there's another way that a scientist might change the data too, not just when the original hypothesis is not proven to be true. Sometimes it may seem, okay, so the nitrogen must have had an effect. But until you test other things like the time of exposure to sunlight per day, you might find that there's actually something else at play, either along with the nitrogen or altogether different. You just weren't able to control for it. Now, hopefully, the scientists would have been able to do this inside of a lab where they could control the amount of exposure to sunlight so that that factor would not change either, which is part of the process of designing your experiment, is trying to eliminate the ability for any other factor to have some sort of an influence. So if the scientists left this grass in its original location in the marsh, they would not be able to control exposure to sunlight. They also wouldn't be able to control exposure to the brackish water. So there's salt and other nutrients in the water. And if the control group is at a lower elevation than the experimental group, it could be possible that the addition of salt water during high tide in the control group would have thrown off the experiment. So you would have to make another experiment to test to see if that factor alone is responsible for the differences that you observed originally. Well, it's important to note that these hypothesis-based experiments, which is kind of what we're dealing with here, are not always possible. For example, sometimes scientists have no initial information on which to even make a hypothesis. And this happens oftentimes when scientists are studying animal behavior in the wild. So the difference between the everyday use of the word theory and the scientific use of the word theory is important to know, because we do hear that term thrown around a lot, and it's often misused compared to the way that we would use it in a science laboratory or in any type of a business that relies on the scientific method, and it would be incorrectly used in our environment as well, in our science class. So what is one way to use the word theory? Well, there are a bunch of different ways, but sometimes the word theory is often not based on a vast amount of evidence like a scientific theory should be. And a lot of people perceive scientific theories to simply be ideas or hunches based on the everyday use of the word theory. But when the word theory is used in science, it refers to an idea that has been thoroughly tested and is supported by a great deal of evidence, such as the theory of gravity. That's not to say that it will never be proven wrong. As a matter of fact, after a long time of a theory being experimented upon and proven to be true over and over again, it will eventually be considered a law. In fact, the theory of gravity really is a law of gravity, which is a little different than a theory. A law is something that we can use to predict future events based on knowing that that law will cause nature to behave in certain ways. And a law is something that we have not been able to disprove as many times as we may have tried. Theories can be disproven a little more often, but generally they tend to be pretty true and pretty accurate in terms of uh, using them as an explanation for the natural world and for our understanding of it. But a theory can be proven wrong. A theory is never set in stone, nor is a law, but a law is more set in stone, if you will, than a theory. But a lot of times the word theory is used and thrown around in everyday life, and it really just means, sometimes it can mean it's a hunch or something like that. Other people will use it as if it's like set in stone and the quote unquote science is settled. Remember at the beginning of this video, we talked about the science being settled, but we now know that the science is never completely settled. But a theory is pretty solid proof, and contains pretty solid evidence for our understanding of the natural world.